2 out of 3 youths here in Singapore are not aware of how to protect the content that they develop. About half of those surveyed said that they want more government-led education and resources to guide and protect their work. Now, these were some of the key findings of a survey by the Intellectual Property Office of Singapore and the National Youth Council to mark World Intellectual Property Day. Rena Lee, Chief Executive of the Intellectual Property Office of Singapore, better known as IPOS, and Sabrina Shiraz, host of the podcast Randomly Relatable SG. They join us live now for more on this. Good evening to both of you. Sabrina, let me begin with you. When you produce your podcast, do you know that you've just created intellectual property, and what do you do to protect it?
Right, if you want me to be very, very honest, at the very start, when I started 3 years ago, I had no idea anything about intellectual property. But as the years went past, I did start to learn a little bit. So a little bit about intellectual property, right? It firstly refers to like the creation of the mind, which may sound simple to grasp, but it's a lot more than just that. So I feel as youths, it can oftentimes be disregarded because of how boring and a little bit draggy it may seem. However, for like a content creator like myself, it's definitely knowledge that I shouldn't leave behind. It's so important to know what can or cannot be done when it comes to the digital space. As a content creator, our work is constantly subject to copyright. So not only might you get into legal issues, but with the entire cancel culture happening right now, your actions may not be forgivable and almost irreversible sometimes.
Absolutely. There is so much to know when it comes to intellectual property. And Sabrina, it took you some time before you got to grips with it. Rena, bringing you into the conversation about this, how can young content creators like Sabrina or anyone else gain the necessary knowledge that they need about what can or cannot be protected?
Well, thank you, Dawn. I think, first of all, the survey has shown us that we have some way to go in terms of raising awareness of the youth. You cited some of the findings earlier, and these findings will enable us to work with our partners to better develop programs and initiatives to help raise awareness among youth in terms of how to protect and utilize their IP so that they do not have to go through the pain that Sabrina went through when she first started her podcast and didn't know what IP was about. Now, in terms of how young people or anyone for that matter can find information, please come to us at IPOS. You can check in. We have digestible, bite-sized information pieces on how you can protect and utilize your IP. Also check our social media accounts. For young people, we have a number of programs, including Flint, which is a Future Leaders in Innovation Transformation program amongst tertiary institutions. And for everyone, we also run complimentary legal and business clinics helmed by lawyers and business consultants to help people who want to know how to protect their ideas, how to develop them, and how to utilize the IP. And this is all part of our Singapore IP strategy for 2030 and building the IP skills in our future workforce as well.
Rena, very briefly, if you will, put into focus for us, what are some of the pitfalls and risks of content creators not knowing, how to protect their intellectual property?
I think we can see it, Dawn, from two perspectives. One perspective as a content creator, which is that if you don't protect your IP, it's liable to be used by others. And you will not be able to defend your ideas against others using your IP. The other perspective is when you don't have that awareness of what are the boundaries around IP, you may actually inadvertently infringe on somebody else's ideas, infringe on somebody else's IP, and that could actually distract from your central core business as you try and face those challenges around allegations that you may have infringed your IP as well.
Sabrina, what was the first step that you took to protect your work?
No, I wanted to say at first I completely agree with what Rena said, because there has been an instance where I got in trouble with IP. So I mentioned earlier I wasn't very aware of what IP was. So what I did was I used a photo from a photographer for one of the posters of the podcast, right? And we did get his permission. But and that is one of the things that we do to protect our IPs also. Like we ask for permission, we watermark our logo, we watermark our content with our logos and all that. But basically for that one scenario, we used this photo, and then the podcast wasn't very well received by the audience. So he got us to take the entire podcast down because he did not want to be associated with that podcast per se. So what I'm trying to get at is that sometimes, even though you feel like you may have protected your IP or others' IPs, right? When it comes to permissions and rights, you still have to be very respectful of the other creators.
Yeah, there can be lots of landmines to navigate. Rena, a last question for you, if you can help me on this one. You know, when you protect intellectual property, it does many things, and it doesn't just protect you, it also attracts funding and interest from other parties. I mean, is that something that young creators might want to also take into consideration?
I think most definitely, Dawn. I think today when we had our World IP Day event, one of our speakers, Louis Louis from FOMO Pay, he actually shared his innovation journey, and the example he gave was how knowing the IP actually enabled his startup to actually gain funding and investment. And this is part of what the Singapore IP strategy will try to do as well, which is to develop valuation guidelines that will help businesses, enterprises, content creators value their IP, and so that they can use that for financing, for monetization, for commercialization as well.
Rena and Sabrina, thank you so much for joining me this evening and talking to me about this concept of protecting intellectual property for young content creators. CEO of IPOS there, Rena Lee, and local content creator, Sabrina Shiraz.